Thank you, Irit. Thank you, Meir, for the invitation. I think first I should say Atmer ve Yesrim for your organization. It's really a pleasure to be here with you at this very special occasion. And I think you stand in a great tradition as Jewish lawyers. Today already the representative from the Brandeis Institute was here, but Louis Brandeis as the first Jewish US Supreme Court judge and also a committed Zionist, as well as, for example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who fought for equality between men and women, are beacons, I think, in general. And I would like to just look at two specific lawyers in the Hall of Fame that are very close to my heart. One of them is Raphael Lemkin, the inventor of the term genocide, as you certainly know, and he showed what not only the darkest point of human history meant in general terms, but also from his own personal experience, who lost 50 of his family members in the Holocaust, and then said, this is what motivated me to ensure that making the destruction of groups of human beings punishable and to go into the legal profession. So he's a true example of how one person can make a difference. And I think when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism today, it's important that everyone makes a difference, because this is the real challenge. We can implement and install all different kinds of measures, legal and non-legal ones, but unless we actually create a situation where civil courage and speaking up when you hear anti-Semitic remarks or other hateful speech is an inherent part of every individual, it will be very difficult, I think, to change the atmosphere and to change society in a way that we can really look at bringing anti-Semitism and other hateful speech back again. The other Jewish lawyer that is, of course, an example in the European context is Simone Weil. She's a Holocaust survivor, and she became in 1979 the first president of the European Parliament, and she was, up until now, only one of two women who ever held this post. And I think it's important to understand that the Shoah really shaped the European Union and the European integration process. In a way, it was Europe's answer to never again, and therefore it is so important also to treasure it and to defend it today. At this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, still, as of 1st of December, we will have a new president, Ursula von der Leyen. He said, "Our union was built on the ashes of the Holocaust. Remembering it and fighting anti-Semitism is our duty towards the Jewish community and indispensable to protect our common European values." Jewish rights are human rights. Actually, if you looked at the quote by Kofi Annan just there, he said something very similar. A society that respects human rights and its inalienability creates a society where Jewish communities and other minorities thrive. And in turn, the thriving of Jewish communities also contributes to the democratization of a society and the thriving of society at large. The struggle for the right of Jews to live, study, and pray as Jews, be they Orthodox or Reformed, believer or secular, will advance human rights worldwide. And whoever questions this nexus questions also the possibility that human rights have to have an impact in general. I will give you a short overview now over what we have done in the European Union over the past 4 years in order to tackle anti-Semitism. As Irit said, I was appointed in 2015, and that came after several lethal attacks on Jewish communities. Already we had the school in Toulouse, we had Charlie Hebdo, and the kosher supermarket. There was the museum, the Jewish museum in Brussels, and then the synagogue in Copenhagen. We had stabbing attacks in Marseille. So we had seen actually in total 11 Jews that died in Europe in that period just for being Jewish. And for us it was very important not to have an ostrich approach. We know that in the past there had been occasions where anti-Semitic attacks were labeled as being or excused by the perpetrator, for example, being socially deprived, rather than calling it for what it was. And we wanted to know exactly how the situation is among the Jewish community with their perception on anti-Semitism, as well as among general population. So we made one survey in 2018 that covered 16,500 representatives of the Jewish community in 12 EU countries. So that's in its representativity, not in its total number, 95% of the Jewish community in Europe, because in the other countries the communities are too small to make representative studies. And then we polled 27,000 European of the general population to know also their perception. And so we know that for Jews in Europe today, 9 out of 10 say anti-Semitism is my number one problem. So before the fear of being unemployed or health concerns. And that, of course, is shocking, and it is a huge challenge. We saw, however, also that there is an increasing acknowledgement of the fact that anti-Semitism is a problem also among general population. So 5 out of 10 say that anti-Semitism is a problem in their country. And I think this is an important figure when you look at creating political action. If half of the population says this is a problem, then politicians usually start to act. Overall, roughly about 40% of all racist incidents that are recorded in the different countries are directed against the Jews, which represent less than 1% actually of, far on European level, but also in particular in some countries where the Jewish communities are bigger. Even there, they're always less than 1% of the population. Sometimes people therefore say, anti-Semitism is so much on the rise, are we in the 30s? I don't think so. I think that we see 3 different differences. First of all, the rule of law. The rule of law is on the side of the minority. Even if the law is not always applied correctly, the law in itself is on the side of the minorities and also of the Jewish people. Secondly, I think that state authorities are reacting. My appointment is one sign, but also there have been many other special envoys appointed on national levels across the European Union. We work very closely together. We have regular meetings. It is very important to exchange best practices and knowledge. And I think that also in terms of measures that are being taken now, we see a momentum where there is acknowledgement of the fact that this is a challenge that needs to be tackled. And thirdly, I also think that there is a change in civil society. It's slow. Usually still after attacks, it's the Jewish organizations that organize the commemorations. I think it should be society at large that reacts. In some cases, this has happened. For example, in Halle, I think after the attack on the synagogue now, we saw a huge reaction from within civil society. And in the end, again, as I said in the beginning, I think it's this change in civil society that will, in the end, bring about the real change. I think also we see that, especially among young people, there is an increasing acknowledgement that you cannot take democracy for granted, and therefore you have to stand up for it. So we see youth organizations pass resolutions where they adopt the IRA definition or where they stand up against anti-Semitism, usually also with parties. It's the young organizations of the parties that pass these resolutions against anti-Semitism, often also very pro-Israel. And we saw also the resolution in the German Bundestag against BDS, which I think is also in its sort something very new in the European constellation. We made a point in the beginning also to say we need to acknowledge all forms of anti-Semitism as equally pernicious. In order to know what they are, we needed the IRA definition, which at the time wasn't even called the IRA definition because IRA hadn't adopted it. But this piece of non-legally binding legislation has become the instrument, really, first of all, as a sign for states, for organizations, for civil society organizations, for schools, for parties, to say we take anti-Semitism seriously, and we recognize that the group that is concerned has the right to say what they think is anti-Semitic. I think that's very important. We would probably acknowledge that right with most groups, but somehow when it comes to the Jewish communities, it has always been difficult. In the survey that we did among Jewish representatives, we asked questions about what they see as anti-Semitic, and to a large extent there is congruence with the examples of the IRA definition that was originally, if you remember, drawn up in 2005. So, but still, in terms of what the large majority of the Jewish community see as anti-Semitic, this definition still holds, and I think is indeed, especially with its examples, very useful. I believe that the attack in Halle has created a shift and is in a way, should be seen as a game changer as to how we see in Europe and we tackle anti-Semitism. We saw in the past attacks from the Islamist extremists. This was the first in a long time from a right-wing extremist. It brought to the fore the situation among right-wing extremism, how dangerous it is, how anti-Semitic it is in its core, even if some of the activities may be directed at other groups. In the end, the nucleus seems to be always anti-Semitic. And I think this has also woken up EU member states to work even closer together when it comes to preventing radicalization and to detecting extremists, to increase their cooperation. We know that for Jews in Europe, security is their number one issue, and that's why we have created or we have first of all negotiated a declaration that was already mentioned several times here today in the Council. So the 28 EU member states agreed to fight anti-Semitism. They agreed on 17 different instruments, and among them was, for example, the adoption and the use of the IRA definition, but also drawing up national strategies against anti-Semitism and increasing the security of Jewish communities. In fact, security was at the start of this whole declaration. And so as a follow-up, in order to ensure that the declaration is not only shelved, we created working group where we bring together, and I think in that sense it's a bit unique, 2 representatives from each member state on a specific topic, and then the reciprocal representative from the Jewish community. We put them together next to each other in the plenary, and so after each plenary session on specific topics, we give them 30 minutes to discuss among themselves, we call it discussion among 6 eyes, their specific issues in their member state. And I was really surprised when we had the first session in June on security, that people came up to me afterwards from the Jewish community saying they had more time in Brussels with their national authorities than ever before in their capital. And I think this is something where we can help. We can help, first of all, by showing them instruments that already exist, that are available, ready made, and can be used in a national context, and also to facilitate this dialogue that is necessary to have joint risk assessments, to ensure that the instruments are agreed, and also to ensure that the costs are borne not by the communities, but really by the state, because it's the responsibility of the state to ensure the security of its citizens. I think that on European level, we have tried to use all the different instruments that we have at hand. So we have legislation. Since 2008, the so-called Framework Decision on Racism and Xenophobia, which criminalizes speech inciting to hatred and violence, and also defines hate crime in a larger context. This legislation has become the basis for the so-called Code of Conduct that was also already mentioned, that if you listen before to Nimrod, you will say, well, what should it change? But I do think that we have created a shift in thinking among the platforms, namely that they have responsibility with regards to their platforms, that they are not just a neutral provider of service, and also that we are building capacity, especially also legal capacity, among the platforms and among NGOs to detect speech that is illegal according to European legislation and therefore needs to be taken down. So the actual takedown rates have also been significantly increased. When we started in 2016, only 28% of the content was removed. Now we're at 72%, and given that not everything that is notified is actually illegal, this is quite a good rate. But I think one has to see also that we need next steps. This so far was a voluntary code of conduct with all the big IT companies, including Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Google and so on. But we will need a change of liability in the end, and this is something that the incoming president of the European Commission has already mentioned in her speech in the Parliament, that the digital single market needs to be completed, and part of that will be also to tackle hate speech online. How much more time do I have? Yeah, I'm finished. Okay, good.
So you can really honestly, like if you have a few more things after the lectures going in the other lecture.
Good. All right, I just say one thing, that we are looking also into education, because I know this will otherwise be criticized, that the EU does a lot, but what about education? We fully recognize that education is in the long run the key challenge, and that needs to be worked at in this working group. Our next meeting now will be on education, addressing anti-Semitism in the classroom, looking at the triangular between Jewish life, anti-Semitism, and the Shoah, and to make sure that we think these three things together in order to prevent anti-Semitism, rather than students hearing about Jews only when it comes to the Shoah or the Middle East conflict. Thank you very much.